we're grateful for all their work. I want to just take a few minutes to speak substantively to you about the urgent matter before us, which is the fate of our democracy. Because I'm deeply concerned that our democracy is hanging by a thread, both here in Wisconsin and in Washington, and it's hanging by a thread largely because of the problem of big money and dark money in our politics. We face a real crisis of representation in both places because of the pernicious role of money in politics. Here in Wisconsin, in some fundamental ways, Scott Walker doesn't rule Wisconsin. And Scott Fitzgerald doesn't rule Wisconsin, Robin Vos doesn't rule Wisconsin, and Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice Pat Roggensack doesn't rule Wisconsin. They are, in fact, all just the water boys for the people who actually rule Wisconsin. And let me just enumerate some of those people that they work for. They're supposed to work for us, but they actually work for a handful of special interests. They work for the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers, and Nancy will run down the history of the Koch brothers. They, through Americans for Prosperity, the Koch brothers group, spent more than $5 million to elect this Walker, Fitzgerald, Vos, Roggensack crowd. And then there's Betsy DeVos's group, the American Federation for Children, so-called. And they're not for children, they're for privatizing our public education system. And they have spent more than $5 million to elect Walker, Fitzgerald, Vos, and Roggensack, not in direct contributions, but in the dark money contributions, in those ads that, splatter mud all over the screen during election time to, assassinate the character of the candidates they don't like. And the person who runs American Federation for Children in Wisconsin, the prime mover of that group here, is none other than the former Speaker of the Assembly, Scott Jensen, the disgraced Scott Jensen, who was pled to a crime during the scandal in 2001. He walks down the corridors of the Capitol with Betsy DeVos's saddlebags full of money, and he's as powerful today as he was when he was Speaker of the Assembly. And so there are others too. The biggest player, actually, is Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, WMC, has spent almost $20 million in these dark money ads over the last 8 years to make sure that Walker is elected and stays elected governor, make sure Vos and Fitzgerald are running the legislature, and to make sure that conservatives run the state Supreme Court. And they get what they want. Almost every single thing that Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce wants, they get. They put out a report card after every legislative session. You can go to their website and they just check off. This box is checked, that box is checked, whether it's high capacity wells or whether it's, a pro landlord bill or whether it's, an anti-labor bill. Everything they want, they get. And then they're powerful single individuals, right? Like Richard Eline. Richard Eline, who gave Walker $200,000, a little more, and gave his presidential PAC $5 million. He gets what he wants in Wisconsin. Now what he wants in Wisconsin is actually to take Tammy Baldwin down, so he's spending millions and millions of dollars in dark money to try to achieve that. And then, of course, there's Diane Hendricks. Diane Hendricks, the richest woman in Wisconsin, the billionaire owner of ABC Supply down in Beloit. You remember Diane Hendricks, don't you? I mean, in the movie As Goes Janesville, a documentary film, she's caught on camera right after Walker's elected, but before he's sworn in, and she goes up to Walker and says, "When are you going to turn Wisconsin into a red state? When are you going to turn Wisconsin into a right-to-work state?" And Walker responded infamously, "First, we're going to divide and conquer." Divide and conquer is what he did. So he delivered for Diane Hendricks, and he and Vos and Fitzgerald and Roggensack deliver for Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce and the Koch brothers and Betsy DeVos and Richard Eline. And the Dairy Business Association, which is a big dairy lobby. It's not for the mom and pop small dairy farms that are being extinguished before our very eyes. These are the factory farms with the 2,000 head of cattle. And this isn't how our democracy is supposed to work. They're supposed to represent us. Our elected officials are supposed to represent the citizens of the state, the citizens of their district. Instead, they represent their donors, this small, tiny group of donors. And that's who they respond to. And that's what I mean. We have a crisis of representation here in Wisconsin. And nationally, we've got a similar problem. I'm not the first one to notice it. I mean, Jimmy Carter told Tom Hartman a couple years ago on progressive radio that we no longer have a democracy in this country. We have an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. Unlimited political bribery. And that's what we look at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign day in, day out, the unlimited political bribery that goes on here, legalized bribery in Wisconsin. And it has its effects. There were two professors, Martin Gillens of Princeton and Benjamin Page of Northwestern, who did a study of 2 decades of public policy. They looked at 1,800 different public policies over this 2-decade period, and it was before Citizens United, by the way. And they were looking at who has decisive influence over what policies are enacted, what laws are passed. And what they found was pretty startling. In their words, and this is a direct quote, the majority does not rule. The majority does not rule. That's not what we're taught in 7th grade civics class, if that class is still taught. It's not what we were taught, or people are taught in high school social studies class, if that's still a subject that's taught. But that is a crisis for democracy if the majority does not rule. And in fact, what they found, Gillens and Page, was that just about the only time that we get, the majority of the people in the United States get what we want, is when the top 1% of the business class and what Bernie called the billionaire class wants it too. Then we all get it, but otherwise we get shut out. And to a large extent, the funding of elections, the funding of candidates, in that process, you and I and almost everyone in this country has been reduced to the role of spectator. And sometimes blindfolded spectator at that, because we don't know who's paying for all those ads. Here are a couple stats. The percentage of people who gave $200 or more to federal candidates, 0.5%. The percentage that maxed out in giving to their favorite candidate for president, which is $2,700, 0.08%. 0.08% of the population is essentially deciding who the candidates are going to be. That's a crisis of representation and a crisis of democracy too. And if I'm going to swing back to Wisconsin here for a second, it is very odd that in Wisconsin, rich and poor alike can give $20,000 to their favorite candidate for governor. The law used to be $10,000. Now it's $20,000. Is governor of Wisconsin really 6 or 7 times more important than president of the United States? And that is kind of crazy the way they've lifted the limits, doubled the donation limits here in Wisconsin. And they also tore down the ceiling. Now, millionaires and multi-millionaires can give unlimited amounts of money to political parties here in Wisconsin, and they're doing it on both sides. And corporations, for the first time in more than 100 years, give directly to political parties now in Wisconsin. Poor fighting Bob LaFollette is dizzy, spinning so fast in his grave over that one. And it's, the funding of politics has become a playground just for the very, very rich. And it's fenced off with barbed wire. As George Carlin used to say, it's a club and you're not invited to it. I know some people will say, as a heckler told me in Green Bay the last couple days, that, well, it's okay because we got liberal multimillionaires on one side and conservative multimillionaires or billionaires on the other side. And, that's not the solution. That's not how our democracy is supposed to work. Our democracy is not supposed to be a tug of war between 3 billionaires on the right and 3 billionaires on the left. In a democracy, we're all supposed to have an equal tug on the rope, and we don't. I mean, everyone knows we don't. And that is a real problem. People in their gut get it, though, and that's part of the good news. The good news is that people in this country are fed up with big money and with dark money. In fact, just last week, the Pew Research Center came out with a poll that said 77% of the American public wants to see more limits on donations from individuals and from groups, including issue advocacy groups. The people are with us on this core issue of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Another piece of good news here in Wisconsin, and I mentioned it in passing, was we have this tremendous effort at the grassroots to do something fundamental about this problem. And that is to amend the U.S. Constitution to proclaim once and for all that corporations aren't persons and money isn't speech. In 131 communities, people have passed referendums by overwhelming margins, or city or county boards have passed resolutions by overwhelming margins in favor of this. 131 communities. And a lot of those communities are red communities. Even in red Waukesha, the thing passed by 69%. And this is the work that Wisconsin United to Amend has been doing so terrifically. More good news here in Wisconsin is the fight against gerrymandering. We had this case before the U.S. Supreme Court. This court heard the case in October and will rule sometime before the end of June. I think we've got a 50-50 chance of winning that one. And even if we don't win, the campaign to ban gerrymandering in Wisconsin not only will continue, but it's gaining ground, and it's gaining ground in this way. In 39 counties in Wisconsin, 2/3 of those are red counties. The county boards have voted that they want to send a resolution to the state legislature to tell the state legislature, you've got to change the way we do redistricting in Wisconsin. We need to have nonpartisan, independent redistricting in Wisconsin. 30 of those counties passed those resolutions just in the last 15 months. This thing is really gaining momentum. And there's an easy solution. I mean, Iowa solved this problem more than 35 years ago. In Iowa, they have a nonpartisan group of civil servants who draw the maps with very specific criteria that doesn't allow them to use political demographic data to tilt a district one way or another. And if it works well in Iowa, like it does, it can work well here in Wisconsin too. And so these two efforts give me hope. And we at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign are playing a role in these efforts. We are active with Wisconsin United to Amend and with the Fair Maps Coalition in Wisconsin. This is the other part of the good news that I see day in and day out working at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. The coalition work that's happening across issues and across organizations. Every other Friday there's a conference call that I'm on with people from League of Women Voters, Common Cause, ACLU, Citizen Action, sometimes Planned Parenthood, sometimes Wisconsin League of Conservation Voters. And we also work real close with Midwest environmental advocates. You know, we've torn down our silos here in Wisconsin, the nonprofit pro-democracy sector. We've torn down our silos. We've pretty much shelved our egos, maybe with an exception here or two. But we're all rowing in the same direction. And I think that is a really important thing to have happen with the pro-democracy and progressive nonprofit community here in Wisconsin. We discuss strategy together, we plan together, we do media events together, we write op-eds together. We testify at the Capitol together, so we're working across issues against this common threat that we face from that handful of special interests that really rules Wisconsin. And I'm confident that with your help, we'll not only give democracy a fighting chance here in Wisconsin and across the country, but we'll actually prevail. So I want to thank you for coming, and I want to let's move on to the main event. And the main event is Nancy MacLean. It's my distinct honor to introduce Nancy MacLean. She's professor of history and public policy at Duke University. She did her graduate work right here at UW-Madison. She's a historian of social movement. Her books include Freedom is Not Enough, The Opening of the American Workplace. Another one is The American Women's Movement, 1945 to 2000. There's Behind the Mask of Chivalry, the making of the second Ku Klux Klan. And the reason we brought her here today, she's the author of the eye-opening and profoundly disturbing book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. It is just a kind of a shocking book. I think it's one of the most important books of the last decade, one of the most urgent books. She was a finalist, or the book was a finalist for the National Book Award last year. She won the 2017 Lannan Foundation Cultural Freedom Award for Democracy in Chains. You can buy the book here, and she'll sign it afterwards, thanks to Room of One's Own. I give you Nancy MacLean.
To be back in Madison. I came here with my husband who's out there somewhere, and we've just been having a wonderful few days here. Every place we go by, I seem to have a new memory of some great thing that went on and some good person who did something or some story. So anyway, it is really, really good to be here. And I have to tell you too, I was never more proud to have been a Badger than in 2011 when you all stood up so magnificently in defense of public sector workers' right to organize and in defense of our basic democracy, and nobody really understood it then, but you were at the first wave of this, and we were all watching, and just so inspired by you, and it is not over yet. What you started is not over yet. So I want to thank Matt Rothschild for inviting me in the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. I also want to give a shout out, I don't even know if they're here, to Eleni Shermer and Joe and Jane Shermer. This is just a beautiful thing. When they saw I was coming back, Eleni had done this really wonderful review of the book, and she's a graduate student here in education at the UW, and they offered to put me up at their place. It was such a great Madison gesture, and as it turns out, it's a block away from the last apartment I had in Wisconsin, so I'm just having the greatest, old home day, or old home weekend here. So anyway, thanks, and it was just this kind of circle of solidarity that's so Madison, and it really felt good to have that. So I'm really thrilled to be here with the Democracy Campaign and with people who have been thinking long and hard about these crucial issues that are before us. And I'm excited to be in conversation with you and in dialogue tonight about my research for this book and the light it sheds on what's happening in our country and what that means for organizations such as yourselves who are trying to fight this, trying to reclaim democracy, and what that means for strategy going forward. So I'll speak for about 20 minutes, I think, about 20, 25 minutes, maybe to set up the conversation, but I want to save most of the time for talking together. I think some of you maybe here have read the book. Yeah? Oh, okay, yeah. Because I was also here in the fall and had a wonderful evening at the Labor Temple, and some folks were there. And I just think for a group like you, I don't want to get into the weeds. I have to say, I think it's an interesting story. It's a story that started, I had never heard of the two people who loom large in this book when I started out on the research in 2006. One of them is the first Nobel Prize winning economist from the US South, a man named James McGill Buchanan, who started something called the Virginia School of Political Economy, and the other is, of course, Charles Koch. And I was not looking for them. What I was tracing was the shutdown of public schools for 5 years in the county of Prince Edward, in Prince Edward County, Virginia, to punish the black students there for having gone on 100% solid student strike in 1951 and launched one of the cases that fed into Brown versus Board of Education. And the county officials in Prince Edward answered the call to desegregate without further delay by, as they put it, going out of the public school business entirely. So they completely shut down the public school system. They posted no trespassing signs. They padlocked the schools, and they left black children with no formal education whatsoever for 5 years as their white counterparts went off to private segregation academies with tax dollars. And this astonished me and moved me when I learned about it in the archives. But what also intrigued me was I found that the entire libertarian movement of the time rallied to the side of the state of Virginia with these tuition grants and this push for private schooling beyond the reach of the federal courts. So I started researching that story. Long story about how it led me to James Buchanan and Charles Koch, but it was a lot of serendipity along the way. But I will say this about that late 1950s crucible of the Koch rights project that I found in Massive Resistance to Brown versus Board of Education, that Maya Angelou was right when she said this: when people show you who they are, believe them. So we won't go into that story because I want to emphasize instead what I see as the value added of my historical research for those who are seeking to defend and expand democracy today. And the import also, I want to emphasize also the import of that research for anyone who has been puzzled by how progressives could have attracted majority support on issue after issue after issue and won local campaigns again and again and again, only to see economic inequality grow and find ourselves losing power pretty steadily as the right has come to dominate now 30 states and every branch of national government. So my book speaks to this question of how did this happen? How did the high hopes of 2008, to take one illustration, and some of us do remember those dimly, but how did those high hopes give way to this? And a public health nurse who read the book, I thought, captured this well when she said, she made the analogy that you need to get the diagnosis right before you can determine the correct treatment plan. And so I think the book tries to provide that kind of diagnosis that can inform a good treatment plan. And I'll state my case plainly, which is that the right has been winning, I believe, because the Koch donor network has very effectively weaponized the ideas of this figure, James McGill Buchanan, and the school of thought he launched, public choice economics, to, in effect, reverse engineer the 20th century liberal state. Above all, by undermining the collective power on which progressive advance depends, and then by rigging the rules in its favor at every step, as you have witnessed in Wisconsin. I don't think I need to review that. But I'll say that where journalists, above all the brilliant Jane Mayer, have done a terrific job of exposing the Koch money trail, of where this dark money comes from, where it's going, what it's funding, and so forth, I happened, again through serendipity, on the source of the ideas that have lately made that money so devastatingly effective. And Charles Koch himself actually boasted at their most recent donor summit that he said, "We have made more progress in the last 5 years than I was able to make in the previous 50. And I believe the reason they have made that progress is because of weaponizing these ideas in ways I'll describe as I go along. But by following the trail of the ideas that the Koch donor network has weaponized, a trail that began not with the election of Barack Obama, and I think this is very important, but decades before, I think we gained several important resources for the kind of work that you're all doing as we go forward. First, I think we gain a deep understanding of the operational strategy of this right, including how that strategy might be blunted. Second, we gain a story that exposes how they are using the means they are precisely because they know that the majority will want to stop their plan if alerted to it. And third, we gain a knowledge of their real endgame, which is an incredibly radical transformation of our society and government, one that would in time force total personal responsibility by undercutting our ability to do the kinds of things that citizens have done together over the course of the 20th century. From regulating corporate pollution and consumer fraud, to building up workers' rights, to creating social insurance systems, to action against discrimination. All of these kinds of things would be undermined by what this right is trying to, the rules changes it's trying to affect in our democracy. So in short, this Koch donor network seeks to, as I put it, following Buchanan's own language, they seek to enchain democracy. The plan is to bind our political process in such a way as to make our institutions unable to comply with the will of the people, at least where it involves significant tax transfers and regulation. And here I think a contrast could be helpful for thinking about the way that they have been working. Where the left, for years, has been issue-oriented, working in silos, so I was glad to hear you're getting out of the silos, working in silos and focusing on short-term campaigns, this Koch-led right has played a very patient long game, one that is aimed at systematically building the power for overall transformation. And they are determined to use this power to rig the rules so as to win across the board through a series of changes that are interrelated and mutually reinforcing. Charles Koch himself has described this project by analogy as stonemasonry. And he says the skilled stonemason takes a great deal of care in choosing the first stone and setting that stone. And then that stone opens up the space for another, and then et cetera, et cetera. And you can think in Wisconsin, Scott Walker, 2011, that was the first stone when he said, we dropped the bomb. That opened the way. But they're thinking in these very strategic terms. So what we're seeing then is not about one sector or a policy direction or even a bunch of issues added up, and it is far more than partisan. It is an audacious plan that has been decades in the making to fundamentally change the relationship between the government and the people, and to do so permanently, without ever having to win the agreement of voters to the project. To grasp why having this plan of action matters, let me quote the head of Koch Industries' Government and Public Affairs Operation, a man named Mark Holden, bloating to an invitation-only summit of billionaire and multi-millionaire donors in late 2015. He said, and I quote, "We're close to winning. They," he was referring to critics of the Koch network, but he might have been just saying, referring to the rest of the citizenry, "they don't have the real path. They don't have the real path." I believe that I found that real path through my research. And again, by serendipity, following this other story, but sort of seeing where it led. And the path starts with gaining control over an ever-growing number of states, again, 30 at this point. And then it moves through those state legislatures as the Koch's elected allies alter the rules of the political game as they go. Among the pivotal changes that they push through are these things that Matt was referring to. Radical redistricting to enable effectively minority rule, right? To let these legislators choose their voters rather than voters their legislators. Destroying the shop floor power and get out the vote capacity of labor unions, especially public sector labor unions, which are the most powerful, progressive, and politically active unions left in today's America. Undermining other strong liberal lobbies, such as Planned Parenthood and trial lawyers. And then, with these core power bases weakened, the strategy moves on to setting the next stones, such as voter suppression, preemption of local victories, whether on living wages, discrimination, environmental protection, what have you, undermining action on the environment, privatization of public resources, and privatization for strategic reasons we need to understand, not for efficiency or quality, but ultimately because they know, and they've talked about this in their strategic documents, they know that they can use privatization to weaken the defenders of liberal government while expanding corporate interest in lobbying to keep what they're gaining through that process. And also, most recently, attempts to undermine the independence of state judiciaries, as you've seen here and we've seen in North Carolina and others are seeing as well. Okay, so where does this path end then? I believe it ends in the ultimate rules transformation, our national rule book, the US Constitution. This Koch-led donor right is seeking a constitutional convention, the first and only such state-convened convention since 1787, and the goal is to amend the Constitution in a manner that would rule out in advance most of what progressive social movements have accomplished. Not just since the 1960s, not just since the 1930s, but since the 1900s. Now, this may sound exaggerated, it may sound impossible, it may even sound crazy, and you might be looking for how to get to the exits, but bear with me and consider this. While the eyes of most journalists and citizens have been focused on Washington for years now, and lately almost all exclusively on Donald Trump, the scores of organizations and elected officials funded by Charles Koch and his donor network have been lining up the authorizations needed to call this constitutional convention. They now have the backing of 28 of the 34 states needed to call such a convention, and a ballooning $1.5 trillion deficit owing to the December 2017 tax bill and the recent budget could help them get the remaining 6. Because here's the really interesting and kind of scary thing. There are 6 states in which the GOP controls both houses of the legislature that have not yet authorized a convention. Idaho, Kentucky, Minnesota, Montana, South Carolina, and Virginia. All 6 of those could line up within the next few years at this rate, especially as the deficit surges. How? Because the first item of business for such a constitutional convention is a balanced budget amendment, something that the right has tried and failed repeatedly to get from the normal political process in Congress. Because once people think it sounds like a great idea until they find it would mean the end of Social Security, Medicare, and all these other things that they care about. But it's a shrewd starting point because it does poll well. And like the lost leader in a grocery store sale, it is designed to get people in the door. And once that convention is convened, it is necessarily a runaway convention. Any legal scholar will tell you. And the right already has 10 liberty amendments envisioned that would come up at this. Okay, not, as Gerda Lerner would have said, not to be believed, right? And all of this, it is true, would be unthinkable without the incredible growing economic inequality that has engorged figures such as Charles and David Koch, and without this kind of strategy. But let me here give you some background on this Constitutional Convention vision. Article 5 of the US Constitution provides two routes to amendment. One of them is through Congress, which we've seen many times, and the other is through 2/3 of the states. The former has occurred many times now, as we all know, sometimes for foolishness, sometimes for really good things that we all value, but the latter has never happened. It is that radical. And this untried route stipulates that 2/3 of the states can call a convention. And here's a funny coincidence. That is in the Constitution because of Delegate George Mason of Virginia, who urged inclusion of this option, fearing that the power of a national government might be used against slave states, such as his own. And he won the assent of his colleagues to this. And as coincidence would have it, George Mason University is today the intellectual base camp of the Koch political operation, with its economics department lining up the game plan, its Mercatus Center pushing out policies to Congress and the states and training staffs from congressional offices, so forth, and its Scalia School of Law advancing the case for the kind of Gilded Age restoration constitution favored by Charles Koch. Now, many of you will have seen this week's exposures about George Mason and about how those faculty were hired. There's an interesting discussion we could have there in the Q&A, but I want to turn to what kind of country would we have if the right is able to achieve these constitutional changes that they seek. James Buchanan was very clear. He said again and again that his preferred constitutional rules were those of 1900. So the libertarian utopia would look a lot like America in 1900, a place where workers had no legal right to organize for collective voice and power, a place where corporations were all but free of democratic accountability, whether for discrimination, or pollution, or consumer protection, a place with no Social Security, Medicaid, or Medicare, needless to say, and more. But not even the Republican voters who are sticking through by Donald Trump through thick and thin would want to live in this America, right? The America without Social Security and Medicare and so forth. So how could the Koch-led right carry out such a radical transformation in a democracy where people don't want what they're seeking? That's where my research brings something new to the table. The operational strategy that Charles Koch and his team of organizations and operatives that he works with, as you know, which is quite extensive at this point, have devised a strategy to surmount this obstacle, one that depends on stealth. It proceeds through a series of what Koch himself calls interrelated plays, incremental changes that build on one another in a cumulative manner, what he calls making liberty self-reinforcing, so that the cause never has to inform the people of the true end game, or even be honest about the purpose of each play that moves the overall project closer to its goal. Why stealth? Again, this is crucial, and this, I think, is the single most important finding of my book. Because Charles Koch and his field generals know from repeated historical experience that their true vision would repel the majority, right? Again and again, people have turned against that agenda once they understood it. As Koch himself said, when he began to weaponize James Buchanan's ideas in 1997, and I quote, "Since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure." Let me repeat that. Since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure. Now,
You're off.
oh, the mic is off? Okay, back. All right. So, should I say it again? Okay. So, Koch said in the speech that accompanied this set-off of this whole project that he began to fund based at George Mason, he said, "Since we are greatly outnumbered, The failure to use our superior technology ensures failure. Now, Charles Koch is a very smart man, much smarter than I think some critics recognize. He is a CEO with 3 engineering degrees from MIT. And when he says technology, what he means is ideas. The kind of ideas that would enable a breakthrough to overcome the competition and make his enterprise victorious. Thanks. Whether that enterprise was Koch Industries, which he has built into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, or whether that is overcoming the majority of the citizenry who doesn't agree with this vision. So what is that superior technology he invoked and called on these people he was funding to apply? He found it, I learned through my research, in the school of thought developed by this James McGill Buchanan, the first US Southerner to win the Nobel Prize. And you could say that the new school of political economy that Buchanan developed, which is broadly called public choice economics, or more narrowly called the Virginia School of Political Economy, what it did was fuse the Southern white conservatism that Buchanan grew up with in Tennessee with the libertarian economics he learned as a doctoral student at the University of Chicago. And as the book tells the story, in 1956, as Virginia was goading the wider South in massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education, having resurrected the constitutional doctrines of John C. Calhoun, if you remember him, to do so, Buchanan was hired as the new chair of the economics department at the University of Virginia. And there, in Charlottesville, backed by the state's elite and the leading funder of free market fundamentalism at the time, which, by the way, was the direct lineal forebearer of Charles Koch's Institute for Humane Studies, there Buchanan crafted a series of cogent ideas to counter the New Deal and the emerging civil rights movement at their very source, which was the then widespread belief in government, in democracy, and trust that it could remedy market failure for the common good. Buchanan's intellectual strategy took dead aim at that trust. He sought to build a field of thought, and he was thinking generations ahead. He didn't want to have immediate impact. He'd actually test students on this. He wanted to build a school of thought that could make the case that even if you had problems with the market, it was still foolish and not worthwhile to look to government, because government could not do what it promised, because politicians were not really seeking to advance the public interest as they claimed. His set of ideas argued that they had to be understood solely as individuals seeking to advance their own personal self-interest, whether that was getting reelected if they were elected officials, or whether that was expanding their agency if they worked for something like the EPA, or whether that was getting dues, expanding dues base for unionists, all of those things. But basically the idea was that all these public actors were really out for their own personal advantage in a world of takers versus makers, and in his chilling version of this, predators and prey. With the predators being the majority of the citizenry making these claims on government that required tax transfers from the prey, the unwilling wealthy taxpayers. One of Buchanan's greatest gifts to the political right, and an overarching one, was this advice. If you don't like the outcome of politics over a long period of time, he told them again and again, stop thinking about who rules and instead start thinking about how to change the rules. Because, he said, the existing rules would produce tax and spend behavior no matter who was in office. And many people in this room, I know, lived through the Reagan years. I was here in Wisconsin in the 1980s. Many of us thought that Reagan did some pretty radical, destructive things to the country. What you need to know is, for the libertarian right convened by Koch, Ronald Reagan was a terrible disappointment. He did not go nearly far enough. He did not do to the job. He backed up from the brink because he was accountable to the voters, which is why you have to change the rules. So, Buchanan's next gift to the right was the outline of what he called a new economic constitution. a new set of inviolable rules to govern the political economy that would end the unwilling transfer of wealth via taxes from productive contributors, as he called it, to parasites, another favorite word of his. And if you read the book, you'll find that these ideas have actually already been tried out and worked. Buchanan was invited to Chile in 1980 by the Pinochet dictatorship to help them craft a constitution that would enable them to lock in all the radical changes they made while they had crushed democracy in Chile. And that document still applies. It is called the Constitution of Liberty. And it has made it all but impossible to reverse the dictatorship's privatization of Social Security and education, despite 2/3 of the people wanting that to happen desperately. Charles Koch noticed this success. Only Buchanan, he found, among the hundreds of libertarian intellectuals he had been investing in beginning in the 1960s, only Buchanan offered an approach that could win. And by 1997, when Charles Koch was getting impatient at the pace of change and worried about the way the country was moving, he concluded that Buchanan's school gave him the technology that could be weaponized to secure this ultimate victory. And so he gave his first $10 million to the Scholars Center at George Mason University, where Koch is now the largest donor at the university, having given well over $100 million. And Koch made clear in the speech that accompanied that first big gift just how ambitious and audacious his vision for his investment was. He said, and I quote, "I want to unleash the kind of force that propelled Columbus to his discoveries." He has also compared himself to Martin Luther of the Protestant Reformation. In any event, we have all felt that force that he wanted to unleash since, as the organizations and elected officials backed by the Koch network have engaged in systematic radical rules change, both in the states and nationally, in a plan that has brought us to the current crisis. We've seen that force in the transformation of the Republican Party, using the new penalty of primary challenges from the right and the new lure of dark money contributions to make its elected officials more accountable to the extreme right donors than to their own voters. One Koch official actually boasts of this, what he calls the accountability play, as our secret sauce, so to speak. And it's causing what Matt was referring to as this representation crisis, because this party has become accountable to an arch-right small group of donors who are far to the right of even the party's voters. So, having turned one of our major political parties into a delivery vehicle for their agenda, the donor network then turned public choice thought into a step-by-step strategy centered on the states to transform our country into a place none of us would recognize and few of us would want to live. That project took off with a big bang here in Wisconsin in 2011, when Scott Walker applied Buchanan's ideas in a bid to destroy the power of public sector labor unions. And what's his name, Rick Eisenberg of the Essenberg, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty actually boasted at the time that this was public choice ideas. And anyway, very interesting, but we didn't know to look for it then. That move was the first of many interrelated plays, and the one on which the rest depended. I think it's worth pausing a moment to say why that was the case. That was because unions were the leading source of countervailing power to corporations, because unions lobbied and worked for public goods that cost taxpayers money, and the right had made it nearly impossible to talk about raising taxes. It was also true because unions turn out pro-public sector voters, and not least, I think, because unions keep alive values like fairness, solidarity, and sustainability. And Wisconsin, as you know, in the wake of that, has become the latest state to authorize this Article 5 Constitutional Convention. My own state of North Carolina similarly became a laboratory for this big bang, as the donors boasted of it, one that shifted North Carolina from being a beacon of possibility in the wider South to being a competitor with Mississippi, for which state would do less for the people. In Washington, too, we witnessed the impact of the weaponization of these ideas in the steady escalation of tactical warfare by the Republican right in Congress, pushed to brinkmanship against the Obama administration by the Koch donor network, which was determined to ensure that citizens not have any reason to believe in government again. They fought, as you know, take no prisoners style on everything. The Affordable Care Act, card check for labor unions, immigration reform, court appointments, environmental regulations, reproductive rights, and more. And then having gotten every Republican frontrunner, every one of the people that were believed to be the viable candidates, to carry their agenda, they created a field so toxic that Donald Trump managed to win. And now, lo and behold, although the media seem incapable of connecting these two stories, most of the media, the Koch wish list is being granted with epic speed by the Trump administration on everything from healthcare and taxation to the environment, education, the judiciary, and on and on. Now, the point I would like to leave you with before we shift into discussion of how this operation can be stopped, which I believe it can, is this. I think we need to stop imagining Donald Trump as the author of the mess that we are in. As another reader expressed to me, also from the medical field, he is the tumor, not the cancer. And the cancer treatment begins with recognizing that for all the toxicity he has unleashed, he is, in essence, the distractor in chief. Yeah. He is keeping us focused on shiny objects over there, his daily tweets, and all the horrific things he does while the Koch agenda moves through every federal department and agency and through the courts. The Koch network brought us to this point, and any viable solution will require exposing this project, understanding it, dealing with it, including on campuses like the University of Wisconsin, which now has, I think, 2 or 3 Koch implants. We can talk about that. And also, above all, engaging in some long-term, strategic, interrelated plays for democracy. And I was thrilled to hear Matt talking about the things that you're working on in this group, because I think they're really important. And I would just end here. That we are at a moment, I believe as a historian, that is going to be a historic turning point one way or another for our society, for the future, for our children, our children's children, generations to come. I have outlined to you a very serious strategy from the right, very sophisticated, very well funded, very well thought out, that is pushing to transform our society. But I also believe profoundly that they are pushing an agenda that the majority of the American people would not support. I do not believe even the majority of Republican voters would support this agenda if they saw it. And I think that there are signs of hope all around us for how our democracy can be defended and reinvented. We see it in a huge surge of energy in local politics, in the indivisible, and our revolution groups that have been so active since 2016. We see it among the courageous Parkland students and all the other young people they've moved into action with the March for Our Lives. We see it in the continuing work of Black Lives Matter to help us appreciate the dignity and the rights of every citizen. We see it in the red state teachers' rebellions against this horrible regime of austerity. All of these people are understanding that we are at an all-hands-on-deck moment for our democracy. And so this, I believe, is a very good time to get involved. And I'm glad that you have a group as great as this to be part of that. And I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Nancy, that was great. It was tremendous tour of the horizon, such as it is. So we're going to take questions for 15, 20 minutes, and there's a microphone going around. So if you could limit the questions to short questions, and that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you. How did Karl Rove defund the left movement during W's reign fit into all this?
Great question. Yeah, this is very connected to all of this. And in fact, the Republican Revolution of 1994 Gingrich was the visible one, but the real strategist was Dick Armey, who was an economist in his earlier career, who was a deep devotee of public choice economics, who was really trying to apply them in this period. So that strategy of defunding the left is, like the rest of this stuff, absolutely applying Buchanan's ideas about changing the rules in order to achieve the outcomes that you want. So absolutely, and it's also worth knowing that the Koch project to transform higher education is really surging and very aggressive now. They're on 350 campuses, and they're also funding these groups like Turning Point USA and Campus Reform to harass progressive faculty, but also Turning Point USA is investing dark money in student elections, student government elections, yes, for the same kind of reason as your defund the left question. That's why I'm bringing it up, because the founder of this has boasted that basically they want to drive, progressive activities from campus. They want to close off the spigots that support things like the PLERGs. I saw there was something here from PERG, there you are, before. So they're really going after the PERGs and all of these other groups, and they want to steer all those student activity funds to these right-wing groups that otherwise don't really have a following among students, but if they win the student government elections, they'll be able to do it. So it's really shocking but sophisticated strategy.
Hi, over here, I guess.
Sorry.
Yeah, my parents lived in Wichita, Kansas for 30 years, which is where the Koch brothers are from. And by the way, the answer to what's the matter with Kansas is the Koch brothers. Because they really have changed the rules, and they're not particularly liked even in conservative circles in Wichita, because they really try to impose things. Actually, a North Carolina question for you, though.
Yeah.
One of my best friends is a professor of evolutionary biology at Duke. And that's a very interesting territory to be that, even though the Triangle is a pretty progressive area. You talk about this campaign to discredit science, almost the flat earthers notion, but climate change, everything else, that's got to be connected to this wider agenda you're talking about.
Absolutely, and the Kochs are among the leading funders of climate science misinformation, and they do that quite aggressively, and that's actually a case too where that leads me to the conclusion that what we're seeing now is a really deadly dogma, right? Because there might be ordinary people who have libertarian ideas, totally understandable. You don't want people to go to jail for smoking pot, or you have questions about U.S. empire and blah, blah, blah. Fine for that, but the libertarian cause, as funded by Koch and this donor network, is so hostile to government that it cannot accept the idea that government would be needed to take action on a threat as big as the planet. So what do? They say there is no threat, right? And they try to systematically undermine understanding of the threat that we're facing while we have this very small window to deal with it. And I'll just give you one metric of how effective their efforts have been at, again, revising the rules to get the outcomes they want. In the early 1990s, there was no difference between the two political parties in their understanding of what was then called global warming, that it was man-made, needed attention, right? Of course, the political party differences about how they might handle it, but no difference on the science. And I have this figure in the book, by 2014, only eight of 278 Republican members of Congress would acknowledge that climate change was man-made. 8 of 278. I mean, this doesn't even exist anywhere else on the planet. It reflects this kind of libertarian, deadly dogma. And you won't be surprised to know that before the George Mason team that came together around Buchanan was pushing climate denial, they were doing research for the tobacco companies. So there's a deep history in this of systematic misinformation. So for those of you who are familiar with Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Denial, it's that kind of story, but linked to this public choice ideology.
Thanks.
And what do you have to say about voting and how we conduct our elections and et cetera?
Yeah, so I think that you are right, that the next few years are going to be really decisive, and it is really time to listen up, pay attention, alert people, get involved. However, I actually do feel somewhat hopeful, and I feel that in part because I've been, since August, traveling every week, often to like 3 cities a week. There is just, people understand that something is going on, and that's across sectors of progressive politics, it's across all kinds of different demographics and communities. People are understanding that what is happening now is a very acute threat that is different from, even though in some ways a continuation of things that we have seen before. And I'm seeing such tremendous new thinking and energy and vision and new strategy going on and breaking down the silos in the way that you're talking about, groups coming together, figuring out how to address this, and the understanding is percolating up. Sometimes I think the media doesn't do a very good job of reporting on it, but it's worth knowing that 5 U.S. senators convened by Sheldon Whitehead of Rhode Island, also includes Elizabeth Warren and growing numbers of others, have actually been holding, they can't hold hearings, of course, because they're not in the majority, but they've been giving speeches on what they're calling the web of deceit. And the web of deceit is the way that the Koch network organizations are working through the Trump administration to radically change policies. And they've been filing FOIA requests for information and doing what they can. So I think a lot of people now are actively trying to alert people to what is going on, to find ways to deal with it. So I do feel hopeful, but I think, this is not the time to be too busy to pay attention, right? This is really the time when people need to get engaged. So I take your point and appreciate it.
Something that you mentioned in passing several times is around the media, free press, and for perhaps economic reasons or perhaps, our dumbing down of understanding what news is about and what it really is, and our patience with looking through more than 30-second sound bites. I'm thinking of the evening news, for example, when the weather report takes up 15 minutes of the whole show, and everything else is 3 or 4 sentences. And we've got the Federal Communications Commission doing all sorts of things as well. It seems that information is perhaps one of the antidotes to what is happening. What do you see about what may emerge around a free press, and are there ways in which we can improve the level of understanding among people through the public media?
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important area, and it's not something that I was following in my research because I was really following this thread of enchaining democracy and trying to understand where it came from and where it was going. But the Koch network has been working, very much with Fox News, with Rush Limbaugh appears at Koch donor summits, and so, so the right-wing media is connected to a lot of this, and we certainly see that with the Trump administration. So there are real issues for us to deal with. I do think it's a two-edged sword, though. I mean, my own work was so dependent on the work of maybe not every journalist, but there's a lot of good ones out there that are exposing these connections and doing that work. You were talking, Matt, about your efforts of your organization to do a lot of this investigative work and to make it available to people. So I think we'll see more and more of that. And I think the public is getting more shocked and angry about some of what's going on. For example, the recent Sinclair Broadcasting scandal where they bought up all of these stations, and then, it was like, I don't know, like North Korea or the old Soviet Union or something, basically everybody's having to read from a script to support the administration. And that's not the kind of coverage we need in our world, right? And so I think a lot of this can be citizen-driven and citizens organizing and acting and finding voices and demanding better coverage and asking the follow-up questions that the journalists don't know to ask and so forth. So, I think there's work for everyone. And what I say when I look at a group like this is, there's so many different people here. You have so many different interests and talents and networks and connections. And if everybody in this room just thought, how could I begin to make a difference as part of this? Who do I know? What organizations do I belong to? Am I in a congregation where people might be interested in action? Do our people, people from my reunion class in college, is there a Koch network group that we need to pay attention to? Like Diane Ravitch did at Wellesley, and they got it out. So there's ways to be active on all of these things, and I think we just all have to kind of do a little inventory of who we are and where our passions are and where our talents are and figure out how to get involved. And I believe if enough people do that, we can turn this thing around. Thank you.